Hello and welcome to another edition of Redleg Roundtable. I am Seth Shaner, and in this edition I am pleased to join in Cincinnati journalist, author, media man, John Kiesewetter. John, thanks so much for taking the time.
I'm looking forward to it. Should be a lot of fun.
Well, you spent years at the Cincinnati Enquirer, and you are currently, I believe, still with Cincinnati Public Radio. Is that correct?
That's correct. I was at the Enquirer for 40 years after graduating from Ohio University. The last 30, I was the TV radio columnist, and I not just covered television and radio news and programming, but I also covered sports, and that's how I got to know Joe Nuxhall pretty well, and Marty Brenneman and others. And then when there was a downsizing at the Enquirer 10 years ago, I joined Cincinnati Public Radio, where I continue to cover media and television, and have done that for 10 years.
Well, that is awesome. The book is Joe Nuxhall, The Old Lefthander Me. I've got a copy right here, holding it up. And I want to thank Kim Nuxhall for making the introductions. He sent me the book with a nice inscription. And I definitely hold that dear. I appreciate Kim and all he did for setting this up, so to speak. Let's go ahead and talk about you, because I like to tell stories of the people we interview. So I believe, you grew up in Middletown, is that right?
I grew up in Middletown. I was left-handed. I was born in 1953, and the first Red season I really remember is 1961, the pennant year. In 1962, at the All-Star break, the Reds were still 10 games over 500, like they were the previous season, except they were buried in third place behind the, or was it fourth place? Behind the Dodgers, Giants, and Pirates. And that July, they brought up a left-hander from the minor leagues by the name of Joe Nuxhall, and he came in relief of Jim Maloney in July, and pitched 3 2/3 scoreless innings, hit a double in the seventh to drive in the game-winning run. So he ended up getting the victory and batting 500 on the season. And he was left-handed. I was left-handed. We're both from Butler County, Ohio. And he became my favorite player. And then my dad told me that he wasn't some young stud who bubbled up through the minor leagues like O'Toole and Jim Maloney and others. And it told me about, 1944 and which was 80 years ago last year, that he came and pitched as a 15-year-old, and then was an all-star twice in the 50s, led the National League in shutouts in 1955 with 5. And what a great pitcher he was. And, I just knew him from there in the early 60s. But so I became a Nuxhall fan, and later in life, professionally, was able to meet him and interview him many times. A big thrill.
It's always fascinating to me when a child, picks their favorite player. And you mentioned the lineage of where you come from and where he comes from, and then being left-handed. Growing up, it was interesting. My timing worked out pretty well, because my the first favorite player was Eric Davis.
Right.
And it was basically that 87 season was the first time I really started paying attention to baseball. And Eric Davis certainly had a great year that year. I've had people around me who pick favorite players, and maybe they get traded quickly, or maybe they just weren't even really as good, but they had some quirky reason why they picked them as their favorite player. But one of my favorites is my son. My youngest son is 9 now, but as a 2 or 3 year old, he decided he liked Eugenio Suarez. He liked to say the name, which having a 2 or 3 year old American English speaking boy say Eugenio Suarez is pretty interesting. And I have some video of him saying it. So it is cool to see how people pick their favorite player when they're youngest. So you grew up, I know you mentioned you went to Ohio University. I grew up one county over from Athens County. So I'm from Morgan County. So I know that area quite well. But you made your way back and you worked at the Enquirer. And it's interesting to me because I also worked in newspapers, and so I have a bit of an appreciation for this, but not everybody knows kind of how beats are set up and how things work. But tell me a little bit about when you started covering basically entertainment, radio and TV. What all did that entail? And did you kind of make Reds on Radio part of the beat? Was that kind of something you initiated?
Well, I want to back up first, because when I graduated from OU in 75, I couldn't get a full-time job. So I took an internship with the Cincinnati Enquirer, which at that time took about 15 college, mostly juniors, I was a senior, to be vacation relief for staffers. So I went to the Enquirer on a 13-week summer internship, and I often say I managed to parlay that into a 40-year career. But late in the summer 75, and most of the interns were getting ready to go back to OU, Ohio State, Northwestern, wherever. And the city editor pulled me aside and said, well, it looks like the Reds are pretty good this year. They might be going to the playoffs. Could you stick around for a month or two? And so we had a handshake deal that I wouldn't look for a full-time job elsewhere if he thought he could get me on eventually. And so I covered a little bit of it. I was you can appreciate this being in newspapers, the local features person for the playoffs. So I went to the YMCA and interviewed some guy who was staying there, who had been to like 30 straight World Series.
Oh, wow.
Or would do a feature on vendors at the Riverfront Plaza before the game. I didn't see much of the game, but I was part of the coverage. Anyway, somebody quit in the county government reporter quit at Thanksgiving. And so they hired me to take that job. And that was my beat for a while. And then I did several other jobs at the paper, including running the feature section, which no longer exists at papers, where we had entertainment and fashion and food, the food section every Wednesday. And my TV critic quit. And I thought, boy, this sounds like a lot of fun. And I could get out of management, stop doing all those meetings, and just cover television. And so I decided that I wanted to cover like everybody, not just the news directors and the station managers, but I wanted to talk to the talent, to the anchors, to the reporters. And I'd be out on stories. I'd talk to as much as I could to the reporters and the photographers as I did on the phone with the general managers and all. And I expanded the scope. My predecessor wasn't into sports, so he didn't do any sports coverage. And I thought, sports is on TV. It's a major part of it. So I took it apart, made it a point to, cover the Reds TV contracts, Reds radio contracts, the different elements of broadcasting that intersected with sports. When the Bengals were in the playoffs one year, through NBC, I was able to stand in the back of the booth and watch Dick Enberg and I'm trying to think. His sidekick was was Little House on the Prairie guy, and I can't remember. Merlin Olsen covering the game, but to the off camera next to him was Bob Trumpy. Mm-hmm. And Bob Trumpy would pass these notes, rip it off a notepad, and hand it down to Olsen. And so some of the comments that Olsen and Enberg made were provided by Trumpy, who was not mentioned on the entire broadcast, right, not seen or anything. But I just thought that was a very insight to me into Trump. So anyway, I also decided to cover radio, TV, sports, and the Reds. And at that point, the Reds TV had gone through a whole kind of revolving door of colored people, Tom Hume and Gordy Coleman and others, and made it a point to get to know Joe and Marty, and it was just great fun to touch base with Marty. He was doing UK basketball in the off season. He did the Indianapolis Pacers one year. Joe was actually their unofficial speakers bureau for a long time, and he'd come to my church, Sacred Heart Catholic Church here in Fairfield, Ohio, every January, and would do a Q&A and talk to the Knights of Columbus. And he would talk 2 hours without any notes, anything. He just off the top of his head. And the first 15 or 20 minutes were why the Reds were going to win the World Series that year, because he was the eternal optimist. And then somebody would shout out a name, Billy Martin, Frank Robinson, Jim Maloney, and he'd just tell these marvelous stories. and they'd literally go till they ran out of beer. So I when I would interview him for things about his contract or other things, and I had the time, I'd always roll tape and say, "Okay, tell me about the time you fell on your butt trying to field those bunts in Wrigley Field, or tell me about Clue, or tell me about Maloney." And so I had a pretty good reservoir of Nuck stories. And then late in his life, right before he retired in 2004, he wrote a book. And I read the book, and none of those great stories that I love to listen to were in it. So that was when I left the Enquirer. I thought, okay, I was going to do a book of some sort, and the most natural thing was to write about Nux, and to use some of these stories from my interviews over the years, augmented by having Brenneman tell his favorite, and I talked to Browning and Bench and Oster and Hal McCoy up in Dayton and a bunch of other people, just to kind of collect as many Nuxhall stories as I could.
Yeah. So part of the book too, I mean, obviously you share the story of him being the youngest player or pitcher or either to play in the major leagues. He pitched at age 8. At 15, he sat the bench for a while, and he ended up getting in the game against the Cardinals. A lot of people know that story. And you mentioned too, like, and when I talked to Kim, he battled back through the minor leagues to come back. That was something else. But I want to talk to you about something that maybe not a lot of people know, because as I was telling you on the phone yesterday, I'm 45. And obviously, I know Joe Nuxhall was a pitcher. I know he was the youngest pitcher. Everybody who's a Reds fan probably knows that. But my remembrance of him is in the booth and kind of being almost grandfatherly to me, right? To me.
Yeah,
So,
he was like if your uncle suddenly became a Reds broadcaster.
right. So the interesting thing as I skimmed through the book a little bit in preparing to talk to you was when he was a player, he had a temper.
Yes.
And it's something I don't know that I knew necessarily, except I'm going to bring up one story that I do remember when I thought, ooh, Joe's got a temper. But, he said to you that people told him he may have won what would have been like 65 more games in his career.
He thought he could have won 200.
Yeah. So explain to me, how does that work? Like, was it just that he would get mad and he couldn't refocus, or where did that come from?
Yes, he had a very short fuse, and that hampered his career. As he told me, he had some great seasons up to about 56, and then he was kind of a 500 pitcher till and then he went 1-8 in 1960, and they traded him in January 1961 to Kansas City. And then he came back as a more mature guy and came back to the Reds in the 60s. But he told me that he would just come unglued. And many of his stories that he would tell, his funny baseball stories, would end with an implosion of his temper. And he told me later that he tried to counsel people like Mario Soto and others to not let their temper get in the way of the command of the ball game that they had. But that was true. He was. Tom Browning told me a story. He loved to play golf, and he and Marty played golf, and actually Marty didn't pick up golf to the late 90s. He had played golf in college, and then he put it aside when he started having family and was starting his broadcast career. But Joe would always play golf. And one time, Tom Browning told me that they're playing in Plant City when the Reds trained there in the late 80s. And they're playing golf one afternoon, and Joe shanks a shot, and he takes his club and he just throws it. And he's under a tree with a bunch of moss, and it gets stuck in the tree. So he takes another club and throws it up in the air to dislodge it, misses, throws another club. And he threw every club in his bag up in the air, trying to dislodge this in this fit of anger to try to get the club down. And Browning said, "I'm just sitting in the golf cart drinking a beer, laughing at this funny old man throwing every club he's got up in the air, And finally, he runs out of clubs, and Nux looks over and sees Browning laughing at him. So he comes back to the cart, opens up a beer, and the two of them have a beer sitting there in the fairway of this golf course in Plant City. Nux finishes the beer, goes back on the course, picks up one club, throws it up in the air, dislodges it, it falls down. And I said to Browning, I said, well, then what happened? He said, well, he bent over and picked up all of his clubs, put them in the bag, and then he got back in the cart and we finished the round.
Yeah, and I guess even as any kind of competitors in life, in any kind of sport or game or something we do, we could probably relate to losing concentration. I remember I was not much of a tennis player, but I remember playing tennis, and you get somebody to 40 love or something like that, and you think, all right, I got to put this away, and somehow you just can't. And so to see a Major League Baseball pitcher who's very good, he was a very good pitcher, lose focus. I don't know if it makes me feel better or worse about the times when that happened to me. Do you remember Joe was still in the booth, and of course the 1990 World Series happened, and Dave Stewart hit Billy Hatcher, and Hatcher was on one of the most famous runs ever. He batted 750, I believe, in the series. He had 7 consecutive hits, I think, to start the World Series. Later on, Dave Stewart was a pitching coach for the Brewers, and there was a game where they literally brought in a young guy. They bring in this young guy, and he hits the first batter he faces. And this whole thing, Hal McCoy or some of the other beat writers go down and they talk to Dave Stewart. But Joe was in the clubhouse, and he used to do the start of the game down there. And he starts saying things about Dave Stewart. And, he told him to hit him. And they go back and ask Dave Stewart, did you tell him to hit him? And no, I didn't. And they come back, and Joe Nuxhall, red in the face, angry, says he hit Billy Hatcher on purpose in 1990, and he told that kid to hit him today. And Dave Stewart was known, his nickname was Smoke, and he had that stare. If you remember when he was a pitcher,
Right.
Can you imagine? It would have been a lot like Don Zimmer versus Pedro Martinez if the two of them would have come across the aisle and from the two clubhouses and gotten after each other. He had that fire in him still.
Yeah, and the other thing about Nux is when he was calling a game, it was his inning. Mm-hmm. You could tell if a player was hustling or not just by the way he'd make a comment, or he'd be, what's the opposite of full of enthusiasm when he'd mention the player, or he'd talk about the guys. I mean, he was a homer, but he was fair and would call out Reds players. I mean, the most famous time is when the time that Larkin had booted a ball or two, and he on the air said Barry is losing it, and it turned out that I think it was a hamstring problem or a groin muscle problem, and like 2 days later, Larkin went on the DL. Yeah. So he was playing hurt and hadn't told anybody, but the fact that Nux would criticize Larkin on the air was a big media story for a couple of days.
Yeah, because people mistook him as being the homer versus Marty, who always quote unquote told it like it was. But you're right. When he got a little older too, though, there were times when maybe he didn't fill the air quite as much, right? So I remember living in Columbus. If you tune in on 700 and you're going across, remember the old dials that weren't digital. You're trying to find the right spot on your dial,
right? Correct.
And there were times if you hit it during Joe's inning, when you got to it and all you heard was a vendor or the din of the Riverfront Stadium, there was a special sound. I think all those World Series the Yankees played in the aughts and the 90s and things like that, the old Yankee Stadium on Fox, you could hear the din of Yankee Stadium, and you knew, I could close my eyes and know that's at Yankee Stadium. Well, the same could be said about Riverfront. And you hit that spot just right, but Joe maybe didn't talk for 12 seconds or more. And it was always very interesting to me, the idea of, we were taught as broadcasters to let it breathe sometimes. Well, Joe did that more than anybody, right? So,
well, except maybe for Wade Hoyt. I'm old enough to remember Wade Hoyt in the 60s, and I would go to bed with a radio under my pillow. and I'd be laying there and it would be dead air. And I'd say, did I just fall asleep or did Waite stop talking?
Hey, right.
Because he was working solo into his 60s before they brought in Claude Sullivan to work with him in his last year or two. But I want to back up if you allow me.
No, go ahead.
You know, when one of the things I'm proud of in this book is not only the great Nuxie stories that he would tell and love to tell at banquets and all, but I did a pretty serious look at Nuxie's playing career, which is not in his book.
Right.
And thirdly, about half the book could be called the Marty and Joe book.
That's right.
And an awful lot of Marty as well. And Marty has repeatedly said, I'm never going to write a book. But you know, when Joe made his debut in 44 as this heralded kid, it's in the bottom of the ninth inning and or the top of the ninth inning, and the Reds are losing 13-0 to the Cardinals. And he goes out there and gives up 5 runs and only gets 2 outs. And then 2 days later, they sent him to Birmingham to their minor league affiliate. I mean, here's a 15-year-old kid they put on the train alone and sent him to Birmingham. And so he pitched on June 10th and finally didn't play immediately down there until July 4th weekend. They had him start a game. And when he started for the Barons, the same thing happened. He only pitched 1 inning. He gave up 6 runs on 5 walks, and then they never pitched him again. So his first year, he was down there till early August, but he never played again. And you're right. He spent 8 years in the minors before he came back to the Reds in 1952 when he was 23. So you're 23 years old, but he's 8 years in the minors. So that's like 1/3 of his life he kicked around the minors before he came up to Cincinnati. And he made the club. And there was one writer noted that, he had, in his debut in 44, he faced 9 batters and only went 2/3 of an inning, only got 2 outs. And when he made his debut and finished an inning, the writer wrote that it only took Nuxhall 8 years to get that 3rd out.
That's funny.
And then like I said, he pitched, and then he came back when I first noticed him in 1962, and he was a totally different pitcher. What happened is he had got traded to Kansas City, and he went like 5-8. It was not a good experience for him, and then he was released, and after the 61 season, which ironically was the Reds' pennant season. So all the years he's been associated with the club, he wasn't on the roster in 61. So in 62, they call him up. But in 62, in late 61, he was cut by the Kansas City Royals. And then he went to spring training with the Baltimore Orioles, which had Robin Roberts and a very young Jim Palmer and some of their pitching studs. They cut him at the end of opening day, at the end of spring training. Then he signed on with the old California Angels. They're only their 2nd year in existence. And he lasted 5 games with them, and then they cut him, and he was out of work. He'd been cut by 3 teams in 6 months and was out of work. Interestingly enough, his last appearance for the Angels was in Detroit, and I think it was Norm Seaburn had doubled with the bases loaded, and the next batter up, Nuxhall wound up and hit him in the ribs. And the umpire threw the ball back to Nux and warned him, and Nux was so upset that he took the ball and threw it in the stands behind home plate, and then they threw him out. And they threw out the manager for arguing, and several other. It turned into a minor brawl for the game resumed. But you think back on it, and again about his temper. Had he not come back to the Reds, his last pitching appearance would have been thrown out of the game for his temper. So he called a bunch of clubs. He's 33 years old. He's got a record of 89 and 89, a 500 pitcher. Nobody wanted him. And the Reds said, okay, but we'll send you to the minor leagues to San Diego. So he went to San Diego and he pitched 9 games. He won 9 and lost 2 and had 7 complete games at age 33. And they called him up, and then he pitched for the Reds 63 to 66. He went 46 and 28.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he was lights out in this last stage of his career. And and when he retired to the booth from spring training in 67, he was the Reds' all-time leader in strikeouts. A lot of this is not known. Maloney quickly passed him,
Mm-hmm.
and then Soto passed him. But he told these great funny stories, but he wasn't a joke on the mound.
No, he wasn't. Well, and rest in peace, Bob Uecker just passed yesterday as we're taping this on a Friday, and Bob Uecker obviously always joked about his playing career and how pitiful it was. But
Right.
You talk about all those things playing, and there's plenty of guys that go behind a microphone after a playing career. But you don't last in the profession, or you're not considered good in the profession if you can't be a storyteller, if you can't do the job. And Joe endeared himself to the Reds community maybe more as a broadcaster than he had as a player. And he was a local guy and certainly a legend for being the youngest to ever play. Like, what were your thoughts on him, the announcer?
I think I mentioned to her, it would be as if your grandfather was doing the game. He was beloved because he was the anybody or
That's
everyman. He could tell you what was going on. You knew what was going on. It wasn't anything fancy. It wasn't the college educated wordsmith that Marty was.
Yep.
But they complemented each other very well. Joe could do both the play-by-play and analysis. He was just beloved here for his folksy, low-key style of calling the game, and his love for the franchise, and his love for the players. I mean, there was his home run call of "Get out of here, get out of here," was from being a guy on the bench in the dugout when a guy hit a towering fly ball, wanting to cheer the ball out of the ballpark.
That's right.
His line, "You swing the bat, you're dangerous." He was. He hit 15 home runs, including one off Whitey Ford in Yankee Stadium. He stole 2 bases, one of which was off Sandy Koufax in Crosley Field. And he was hitting when he played for Kansas City in 61, which was obviously decades before the DH. He was when he would pitch, at least in the first half of the season, April, May, June, July, when he pitched, he had the biggest batting average in the KC lineup.
Yeah.
And they began to use him as a pinch hitter because he was so good at putting the ball in play. So, and it really irritated him when a pitcher would go up and not even try to swing, or not even try to adjust and try to put the ball in play, try to better himself for the game.
Yeah, I recall many times when he and Marty would be calling a game, and it's late in the game, and maybe the manager's out of options off the bench, and you're kind of forced to let the light hitting catcher or even a pitcher go to the plate. And it almost be like Joe would say, "Well, yeah, this is all true, but," he's like, "We'll see if you swing it bat, you're dangerous." Yeah, so he would say that, but he would almost give you hope as a fan, like okay, here we are. It's not very likely, but Joe thinks we can maybe do this.
Exactly. I mean, he was, he knew that, when he went up there, that he was trying to get a hit. He was trying to get on base. He was trying to, like I said, he stole a base off Sandy Koufax, and he told the writers after the game, he said, "Well, no one was watching me." I mean, Sandy wasn't paying attention to him, so he took off for a second. He said, You know, if I'm on second, and since he was batting ninth, Pete was up next
Mm-hmm.
and could drive him in, or if they throw him out, then Pete leads off the inning.
There
So
you
we
go.
figured that either he's thinking baseball theory and strategy uh, all the time, and that still was applied to him, the mentality, the mind frame that he brought into the booth.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was thinking of two things, personal experiences, and one of them is meeting him in person, but the other one. So as I mentioned, I was in broadcast school at Ohio State. I was a journalism major for broadcast, and we called the Ohio State football, basketball, and baseball games. And I still remember to this day, we're at the spring game. Ohio State holds a spring game every year, and we end up. They had to have it at Columbus Crew Stadium because Ohio Stadium was getting renovated, and we're in the parking lot there, and we're getting in the car, and it's probably still spring training, honestly. And they start the game's on, and it's Joe's inning, and my broadcast partner at Ohio State was a Pittsburgh native, and he grew up listening to Bob Prince and then some of the later guys, and we're in a car, and he said, "Man, this guy gets to call Major League Baseball." He's like, "We're better than he is," and you talk about temper. I've never lost my temper more over something that really didn't affect me. I started yelling at this guy. No, he's a legend. You do not talk about him that way. And just that thing. And as you said, maybe the wordsmith. He wasn't the wordsmith. I mean, Dizzy Dean went through
Yeah.
this, right? He had Dizzy Dean back for the Cardinals after his playing career. He had school teachers petitioning the Cardinals to fire him because his grammar was so bad.
Yep.
Wait, Hoyt, you've talked about. This is part of baseball, and to a lesser extent today, Jeff Brantley with more of a southern draw and a little bit different sound than what most people around the city of Cincinnati are used to. So, but that's part of the game, isn't it? Like just it's part of the charm.
You mentioned Jeff Brantley, and it took me a little bit to warm to him.
Yes,
but I think that his insights, particularly into the pitcher strategy, have been excellent. But it made me wonder, my trying to get used to him, what Cincinnati must have been like in '34 when Red Barber came up from Florida and
that's right.
talking about the pea patch and the catbird seat and all this stuff and all the southernisms that he had on Cincinnati radio doing the Reds in the '30s.
No, that's something else completely. And Red Barber went on to have a great career with the Dodgers, but yes, he did start there. The funny thing is too, when I talked to Marty on this show, we chatted about, as I was mentioning, the guy I worked with was from Pittsburgh. The first baseball game I ever played was an Ohio State baseball game, or called, and I have the first 3 innings, and we go through back and forth, my partner and I, and then the game starts, and I settle in to call the game. I've never done this before, but I know how to do this because I've listened to Marty and Joe so many times. And the first pitch comes across the plate, and I call the pitch, and I get ready to continue to talk, and all of a sudden the guy next to me starts talking also. And I said, "What are you doing? This is my inning. This is not how you do this." And here in Pittsburgh, they treated it more of a play-by-play in color, and they both talked. Well, Marty and Joe, and maybe before Marty took the booth when Al Michaels was around, for the most part, if it's your inning, it's your inning. You talked. And I asked Marty about that, and Marty just kind of said, "Well, it's just the way we did it." But it is kind of different, there's rarely any other drop-ins when it was Marty and Joe.
Except when there'd be a misplay or
Yep.
a terrific play or something. It surprised me in talking to Marty, and then the famous call of 4192 by Marty. I don't know if he talked about this.
Yeah,
with
we
you,
did. It's awesome.
but years later, Joe looked at him and said, "I'm sorry." He said, "What are you sorry about?" He said, "I'm sorry that I stepped on your call," because in the background you could hear Joe shouting, "Get down, get down!" Wanted the ball to drop for a hit, and Marty Bailey said it didn't bother me because that's just the way Joe was, and it was a very a very pure moment of their relationship that he would jump in and be cheering for the ball to drop, even though it was Marty's call of the historic moment.
Mm-hmm. No, that's true. And even Marty and I talked about that, and I said, well, yeah, I mean, if you listen to Bengals games on the radio, you're going to hear Dave Lapham. You're right. So a home run call or or the famous Pete Rose hit, you were going to hear from him. But aside from like analysis of the incoming pitcher, you really didn't. They let each other kind of have their own innings and things like that, and then they would introduce each other into the conversation if a game was maybe boring or the season wasn't going well.
I don't know if
Go ahead.
Marty told you this story, but it was so much of Joe's inning that in the late 70s, Marty would read a novel
Yes.
in the booth while Joe was calling the inning.
Mm-hmm.
And Sports Illustrated did a piece on Joe and Marty and spent the weekend with him back in 78 when the Reds went into New York for a series with the Mets. A writer asked for permission to spend the time because really the focus of the piece was Joe and the fact that he was still throwing batting practice in his late 50s. But noted that while Joe called the inning, Brenneman would read a book, not about baseball, of course. He was a big reader and would read, always had a novel with him for the bus ride from the hotel to the ballpark back. But in those days, he'd have his headphones on so he could hear what Joe, but he didn't watch the game. He was reading a book. And that led to, so when the story comes out, actually, Dick Wagner got mad at both of them.
Of course.
You'd think of a big 2-page spread in Sports Illustrated in the late 70s during the Big Red Machine that Dick Wagner and the Reds would be thrilled, but Wagner was pissed. And so he calls Joe and said, because Joe in the story said that after pitching BP, then calling a game, he'd go home, and his routine was to get a box of crackers, a pound of Colby cheese, and a 6-pack of Michelob, and watch the Johnny Carson's Tonight Show, and eat cheese and crackers and drink Michelob. And Wagner called him up and chewed him anew and said, "Joe, don't you realize our sponsor is Stroh's?"
That's right.
But the next day, Marty gets a call from Dick Wagner's secretary. I want to know, can you come in a bit early? So he comes in and he comes out of Wagner's office, and the Sports Illustrated story is on this big desk in front of him. And Wagner goes, "Did you see this?" Tapping on the article, and Marty says yes. Says, "Is it true?" And Marty said yes. And then Dick Wagner proceeded to just rip him a new one, saying, "This is the most unprofessional thing I've ever heard of. We don't pay you to read a book. We pay you to watch the ball game. I can't believe this is in a national magazine. Everybody sees it. You do this again, you're gone."
Mm-hmm.
So on the next road trip, they go into Montreal. And I guess Joe didn't pitch batting practice that day because he gets up to the booth early and he tells the engineer, at some point in the ball game, I'm going to lean back in my chair and put my hands back behind my head. And when I do that, I want you to kill the microphone and then cue Marty to come back, even though we might be in a commercial break. So Marty does the first inning, Marty does the second inning, and after the second inning, Joe leans back because Joe's going to do the third. Joe leans back in his chair and puts his hands behind his head, and the engineer does what he said. He turns off the mic, waits a few minutes, and cues Marty. And Marty said, "Welcome back to Montreal. Here's the red score. And now with the third inning, here's the old left-hander, Joe Nuxhall." And Nuxhall looks over at Marty and says, "Hey, Marty, what book you reading today?" and Marty said he saw his whole career flash in front of him.
That's right.
And he called Joe under his breath every name in the book. But it was Joe. I mean, there's many stories in the book about how the pranks that they played on each other in the booth. But this was one of the rare times that Joe, who was a butt of a lot of those jokes, got even with Marty. And when Joe told me the story, he was like grinning from ear to ear and laughing about it. And it was like 20 years later, but he was so proud that he had finally gotten gotten his little buddy on a prank.
You know, the idea of Joe as your uncle or your grandfather, the first ever Reds Fest, I believe, was between the 96 and 97 seasons. My memory is they held it in December before Christmas, whereas later they would hold it in January. But I had 2 passes, and my grandfather and I went down there. And my grandfather had a program from 1941. So my great grandmother died either in childbirth or a day or two after my grandfather was born. And he went to live with an aunt and uncle. And then my great grandfather remarried in 41. And his honeymoon was to drive from near Athens, Ohio to Cincinnati to watch the Reds play.
Oh,
And of course, here's the thing. When my grandpa tells a story, he tells it the same way every time. So I've heard it 100 times. So he'd say, well, driving from Morgan County to Cincinnati back then was like driving to California now. And so that long drive, and they get over there, and it turns out, though, it rains for 3 consecutive days. And I don't think they even got to see a game, but they got to go to Crosley Field, and he bought a program. So we still have this program in my family. And in 1996, we go to Reds Fest, and my grandpa's mission is to take this program and show it to Joe Nuxhall. And of course, this is 3 years before Joe made his debut. Joe was not even, that would make him 12 years old at the time, and from up at Hamilton. And we kind of got off. We saw Joe, and he was off to the side. He was either leaving or about to go to a different, booth or something like that. And so we sidle up to him and talk to him. And listen, the guy was probably barraged by people all the time, but he made it seem like he was delighted to see us. And I still remember like a PR lady get brought up. She was a young, probably 20-something employee of the Reds. She brings up a Diet Coke bottle to him. And the whole time he's talking to us, he's got this Diet Coke bottle almost nestled in his hands. Like, that's just, the type of moment it was. I remember everything about it. And he was just thrilled to look at this program and to talk to my grandpa about it. And, so that's one of the lasting memories I'll have of Joe.
His wife, Donzetta, had told me that, he never finished a meal. He did not mind that people would come up and interrupt him and all. And the stories I hear about people who'd see him in spring training, around the ballpark, at a restaurant or whatever, and just how kind he was. And several, talk about he had a photographic memory. I mean, if he met somebody or played golf with them, years later when he ran into him, he'd know the guy by name and could ask about the other people in the foursome. Unbelievable. Of course, I also said, I asked Donzetta, I said, of all the post-baseball careers he could have, did it surprise you he went into broadcasting? And she told me, I just couldn't imagine him on the radio. English was never his good subject. I once did a profile of him when we had a Sunday magazine, and I wrote a line that about Joe that I knew my editors would take out, but they didn't. And in a profile, I once wrote that Joe Nuxhall interviewed Tony Perez on the Star of the Game. Neither of them spoke English.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's really funny. I had 3 more questions for you. So I had Steve Fizziak on, and he did Reds TV for a few years.
The Fizz Man.
Yeah, and so that was a different time because he would do the TV, but Joe and Marty would switch off and be in the TV booth, and they go back and forth between radio. Do you recall that? And then
Yes.
Just an odd kind of setup.
The back then, WLWT Channel 5 carried the Reds, not a cable channel, because cable wasn't that much of proliferation back then. And actually, Channel 5 had done the first Reds game on television in 1947 before WLWT went on the air as a commercial station. As an experimental station, they did a game. So they were the Reds. They were the Reds flagship station until like 1995 or 96.
That's right.
When they went to Sports Channel or something else. And part of the problem, because when I go to LA as a TV critic of the press tour, in May sweeps, NBC would run these two-part movies, miniseries, Sunday and Monday, but Channel 5 would schedule a Reds game on Monday night, so they didn't carry the two-part miniseries, and it really upset NBC that a lot of their big expensive ratings blockbusters weren't airing in Cincinnati because of the Reds. But because of the Reds, Fysiak, who was the sports anchor, was a broadcaster. So in 1986, the general manager of Channel 5 got the idea of, let's put Marty and Joe on TV. And they promoted it heavily that Marty and Joe were going to be part of the Reds TV broadcast. Well, what happened, though, was that Marty would do TV and Joe would be on radio. And then for a couple innings, they'd switch. Joe would be on TV and Marty would be on radio. Well, Joe was on radio solo for like 6 innings, which was way too much.
Sure.
And eventually a guy named Andy McWilliams, who was on WLW sports staff on the radio side, came as his partner, so he'd have some could catch a break and have someone to talk to. So on opening day in 1986, that night the sports talk lines blew up in Cincinnati on WLW's AM sports talk, and it wasn't because the Reds won. It was because Marty and Joe weren't together on the radio.
That's right.
And it was a 2-year contract. And so it went on for 86 and 87. But it was a real testament to the power and the love of Marty and Joe that they were broken apart for this, even though the TV station thought that they pulled a real coup to have Marty and Joe on the radio. But what they didn't say is, but Marty and Joe will never work together.
Yeah, and that goes
on TV.
On the games that the TV broadcast. They didn't do every game.
Yeah.
But that also goes to the next question I have for you. In your profession, especially covering TV and media, Cincinnati has a rare place in media. Like, you think about sports talk, and you mentioned Bob Trumpy earlier, and the kind of thing that he helped birth, and
right.
And even WLW as a whole, Gary Burbank and Furman and all the different characters over the years. And because they could throw that signal out so far, and even their TV personalities and things like that, and you just think about it, and it's just for being a Midwestern town and not necessarily one of the big cities around the country, Cincinnati's pretty rare when it comes to that, isn't it? Like radio and TV and the importance of the personalities.
For several reasons, that they boast that at night, like when Trumpy did sports talk and now Lance McAllister, they reached 38 states. Mm-hmm. They reached more than half the nation. I mean, I've gotten them when I've been on vacation in Bradenton, Florida, and in Morristown, New Jersey, and in Maryland and Virginia. So they have a blowtorch of an AM signal is one. Number two, the original owner was Pal Crosley, mm-hmm. who owned the Reds in the 30s all the way until his death in 61. But he and his engineers were very innovative. I mean, it was a real technology hub, much like RCA, NBC, GE, and then there was Crosley. And Crosley did several things in the 30s. They were given permission to broadcast at 500,000 watts instead of just 50 watts. So the most powerful commercial station ever in American history. And in fact, they weren't sure how powerful it was when FDR flipped the switch to turn it on. They had this big party at the Netherland Hilton in Cincinnati, and they spoke for a few minutes in Italian, hoping that Marconi could hear them in Italy. And so from this technological hub, then it came television. Well, part of the reason, let me back up. I interviewed a guy who worked at WLW in 29 and 30, and then went to New York to NBC. And he said the equipment we used on radio at Crosley in 1930 was better than the equipment that RCA had at NBC in 1930. Wow. So, And then fast forward to television. And once television gets on the air in Cincinnati, Crosley had stations also in Columbus, Dayton, and Indianapolis. So they had this Midwest network that their shows, there a lot of date in the golden age of TV in the 60s, a lot of live shows with Ruth Lyons, later Bob Braun, a guy named Paul Dixon, just a crazy host. And so they were seen on 4 different markets, not just Cincinnati. So for both of those reasons, Cincinnati had an outsized impact on broadcasting in the Midwest and the nation's history.
All right. And so the last question I'll have before I let you go, I appreciate all your time. We talked a little on the phone yesterday. Can you briefly sum up this situation with FanDuel and kind of the position we find ourselves in as fans wanting to watch the Reds on television?
It was a real surprise earlier this week when the Reds announced that they weren't going to go with MLB, as I said, in November, right before Thanksgiving, and go back to FanDuel, which used to be Bally and Diamond Sports. It's now been rebranded as FanDuel, and the company Diamond Sports Group, when they emerged from bankruptcy, is now Main Street Sports. So they're going to be back on there. It's a 1-year deal. They're going to do a 30-minute pregame, a 30-minute postgame like they had before. Excuse me. They didn't say anything about whether there's going to be repeats of it, different day parts as they've done before. At this point, we're talking Friday morning, the 17th. They still haven't announced prices. Mm-hmm. They still haven't announced announcers.
Right.
Although the Reds Caravan starts this weekend, and excuse me, it starts this weekend, and among the people on the caravan is in the Reds release is, quote, Reds broadcaster John Sadak. So right. I'm assuming John is back. I'm guessing, and so I know that Jim Day and Jeff Brantley are back because Jim Day and Jeff Brantley are hired and work for the Reds, whereas Sadak worked for the baseball TV production company.
And I was told by Chris Welsh himself in December he will be back in some capacity.
But was that when they were with MLB or with
it was when they were with MLB? Yes.
Okay, so I expect him to be back. It helps with the continuity. So anyway, long term after this year, it could go to MLB. The deal will allow FanDuel, formerly Bally, to also stream the games, but they're allowed to stream in market, which they couldn't do before, and it upset a lot of people who didn't have Bally Sports cable, because the only way you get to the stream is by being a subscriber to Bally or FanDuel. That's the same way it is. And I saw yesterday, that the price for the streaming package was, I think, $19.99 per month and $189 for the year. Now, down here in Cincinnati, we also have a second cable system that Cincinnati Bell has called Autofiber. And when the Reds dropped FanDuel, Autofiber dropped FanDuel too. So they have to, in some way, restore that. But when they dropped FanDuel, they didn't cut my rates. Mm-hmm. My guess is when they add FanDuel, they're going to raise my rates. But that's me. So
pretty amazing, pretty interesting. The future certainly is streaming, and the RSNs, the regional sports networks, have had a stranglehold on blackouts and all sorts of things. I used to say here in Columbus, because I could buy the MLB extra innings package as far back as like 2000 or so, but I couldn't watch the Reds games that were only broadcast by the opposing team. They would black it out because they want to divert you to your local broadcast. But back then the Reds didn't do every game. So I always joked it was interesting to me that a guy in Idaho could watch more Reds games on TV than a guy in Columbus, Ohio, or Cincinnati, Ohio. So it's been a mess.
And not being able to stream local games in market mm-hmm. has been the number one complaint to MLB.
Right.
So this is the first step. It kind of surprised me that they're going back to the cable deal, but it's probably only going to be for a year.
I agree with that. Yep. Well, John, I really appreciate all your time. I've enjoyed getting to know you a little bit, and talking about your career, but also Joe Nuxhall. He was a treasure, and we certainly love to remember him.
And let's get a quick plug for myself.
Yes.
Joe Nuxhall, the Old Lefthander Me, is available on Amazon. You can order it from Amazon. I do have a website that I called TV Kies, TVKIESE.com. And if you order it from there, then I'm a one-man operation. I actually mail it myself.
Great.
But I can sign it personally to you if you'd like it signed personally. So this
Okay.
has been great, Seth. Thank you for the opportunity.
I appreciate your time, and thanks again. And thanks to all the folks who download and listen or watch. Thanks so much here on the Riverfront.